Okay, if you are joining us and you are hoping to see a webinar on Palestinian public opinion, I'm happy to say that you are in the right place. Welcome to this J Street JStream webinar. I am Debra Shushan, the Director of Policy at J Street, and very pleased to get us started with today's webinar, as I see some folks are still filtering in, but we've got a really good critical mass. And obviously there is quite a bit of interest in the topic of Palestinian public opinion. Really, I would say since October 7th, I have noticed that this is a topic, perhaps, a top question that I've gotten from J Street leaders and J Street supporters to talk about Palestinian public opinion, both in the occupied Palestinian territory, both in Gaza, in the West Bank. And so I'm very happy to be able to share with you one of the foremost experts, if not the foremost expert on this topic, who can share with you his expertise on this very important subject. And I'm going to introduce Dr. Khalil Shikaki in just a moment and tell you a little bit about him. Before I do that, let me mention that in our J Street webinars, if you're new to them, we always do have time for Q&A from the audience. And so I ask that if you are interested in posing a question at some point during the webinar, you can do that by going to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to those, as many of them as we can, in due course. I'll also mention that a recording of this discussion will be available later today on our YouTube channel for you to rewatch it if you'd like to do that, and also share it with your friends and family, some of whom may think that they are experts on Palestinian public opinion. So it'll be a good opportunity for them to hear from Dr. Shikaki. My colleague has just put the URL where you can see our YouTube channel in the chat. So please do check there later today if you are interested, or any day thereafter if you are interested in checking out and possibly sharing the video. So without further ado, I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Khalil Shikaki. We really are privileged to have one of the, if not the foremost expert on Palestinian public opinion in the world with us today, which is very exciting. I'll say a little bit about him. Dr. Khalil Shikaki is a professor of political science. He's a leading pollster, and he is director of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, which is based in Ramallah. Dr. Shikaki and his team regularly take the pulse of the Palestinian public in the West Bank and Gaza. They've conducted more than 200 polls since 1993 on a regular basis. And since 2000, they've also conducted dozens of joint polls among Palestinians and Israelis. Dr. Shikaki is a senior fellow at Brandeis University's Crown Center for Middle East Studies, and he's taught at several universities, both Palestinian and here in the United States. Dr. Shikaki, I'll also note, is on the steering committee of the Arab Barometer, which is a nonpartisan research network that's been conducting public opinion surveys across the Arab world since 2006, and they do really important work as well. If you haven't heard of Arab Barometer yet, I do really recommend them to you. It's a fantastic organization and a great tool for all of us who are interested in Arab public opinion. So with that said, Dr. Shikaki, I'd like to get the conversation started by kind of establishing a baseline for Palestinian public opinion in terms of where it was before October 7th. And I'll frame it this way. After Hamas's horrific attack inside Israel on October 7th, there were many people, some Israeli politicians and members of government and others who made the claim that there are no innocents in Gaza, that all Palestinians support Hamas. And some of your colleagues at the Arab Barometer, in particular, two of the principal investigators there, Dr. Amani Jamal, who's a very important professor, teaches at Princeton, Michael Robbins, co-wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs, which was entitled "What Palestinians Really Think of Hamas." And significantly, they were writing about polling that the Arab Barometer had done in the West Bank and Gaza immediately prior to October 7th, right? Actually, late September, early October. And they were using those findings, very interesting findings, to talk about the unpopularity of Hamas in Gaza leading up to October 7th. So I would love it if you could say more about that, talk about that particular polling, and kind of set the scene of what Palestinian public opinion looked like, particularly vis-a-vis Hamas, before October 7th.
Thank you, Debra, and I'm happy to be with you. The piece that my colleagues, Amani Jamal and Michael Robbins, wrote immediately after the eruption of the war was based on the survey that we conducted indeed to the last day just before the war. We completed the data collection in Gaza. It did show what our other surveys have been showing during periods of status quo meaning there is no good news, no bad news. Bad news in this case would be war. During these periods, the support for Hamas is usually restricted to those who share Hamas's values. Periods in which there are wars, support for Hamas spikes significantly for a short period of time and then reverts back to where it was before, 3 to 6 months after that. Periods in which things look promising, for example, expectations that elections are about to take place, things change significantly also, but this time against Hamas and in favor of other political parties. So normally we have these three environments in which we conduct our surveys. And so the survey that we are now referring to that was mentioned, that is the Arab Barometer survey, was conducted during status quo time. Status quo time means, once again, that support for Hamas is restricted to those who share Hamas's values. However, before I get into that, let me just say, overall, in the entire history of polling, we have never, ever seen Hamas having a majority of public support, a majority meaning more than 50% of Palestinian public support, whether in Gaza or in the West Bank. Never in the entire history of polling, not even during war times, and not during this time, today, there is no majority support for Hamas, either in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip. So the idea that all Gazans support Hamas or supported Hamas before the war or support it today is absolutely rubbish. Now, before the war started, the level of support for Hamas in the West Bank was 12%, and in Gaza, 38%, based on a survey that we conducted a month before. The survey that was conducted soon after, that is the Arab Barometer survey, the findings were also similar, slightly different, because the question was slightly different, but they were essentially similar. There was no majority support at all. The survey of the Arab Barometer, however, is also focused on governance. And so there was a great deal of criticism of Hamas because of corruption, perceived corruption in Hamas's administration, as well as difficulties in service delivery, authoritarianism, lack of liberties and freedoms, and so on and so forth. However, one thing that the Arab Barometer survey did not ask, but we did ask about a month before the eruption of the war, was support for violence. And support for violence was very, very high at that time, both in Gaza and in the West Bank. In fact, we had a majority of Palestinians who supported violence, armed struggle at that time. Now, if this would be early to mid-September 23. But if I take you back a year before that means a different Israeli government. In between, we have the current Israeli government. The total level of support for armed struggle was 35%. It increased to 53% a year later. This is entirely the product of the new Israeli government and what the new Israeli government was doing. So the war started with a significant rise in support for violence that has been gathering since the establishment of the new Israeli government. Concerns about Jerusalem, about settler violence, about holy places, about annexation. These were all issues that were in the public mind. And so when Hamas started the violence, we did see significant support for that decision. The support for that decision was based on the belief, the overwhelming majority of the Palestinians, that the Palestinians, no longer have a diplomatic option to end the Israeli occupation. Without a diplomatic option, there was absolutely no way for the Palestinians to go other than violence, because they did not believe in the efficacy of non-violent means of struggle. This is what the Palestinian Authority has been pushing for. But there was no public support for that idea. No majority, although a majority of Palestinians did say, sure, why not? Let's do that. But when asked to choose what would be the most effective means of ending the occupation, support for armed struggle was number one, and diplomacy and nonviolent resistance came a distant second or third. This is the environment, therefore, in which the war occurred. The offensive on October the 7th started with that in mind.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shikaki. I think that's incredibly helpful in setting the scene. And I think the picture that you're painting, as I understand it, is that in the backdrop of this current ultra right-wing Netanyahu government that's been in power now for just over a year, Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory felt like they had two options: the status quo and armed struggle. And against that backdrop, without a diplomatic option, the support for the latter was quite high, leading up to October 7th. And I think that's very helpful for us all to understand and bear in mind. So I want to turn from the surveys, the Arab Barometer and the PCPSR surveys prior to October 7th, to the most recent survey that you at PCPSR have done, which has really gained a lot of attention, a lot of media attention, a very important survey. And one of the things that I really have two things that I want to ask, two main things. So maybe I'll just put them both out there and you can address both. One is, the content of the survey, or of the results, for you to share with us what you think the key results are, and whether there's anything that came out of those results that surprised you as someone who obviously has been looking at these results over a long period of time and maybe defied any expectations. The other thing I'd love for you to speak to, and I know we've already gotten a question about this in the Q&A, is the methodology. How on earth, and I ask this as a political scientist myself, do you go about conducting polling in a wartime environment, as we all know exists in Gaza? And I'm sure many of our viewers would be very interested to hear about that. Thanks.
So let me answer the second question first, and then I'll go back to address the main findings and what was surprising in these findings. You're right, of course. The war conditions are certainly not optimal for conducting surveys. Most importantly for us, the safety of our data collectors was for us the top most important consideration. But we also had significant concerns about sampling, particularly in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. So these were the two issues that we were looking into while preparing to conduct that survey. We decided we will not conduct any surveys as long as the fighting was ongoing, and because of the safety of our data collectors, and therefore we were obviously delighted that there was a ceasefire, and we waited for that ceasefire. And the minute the ceasefire took place, we were already there. The first day of the ceasefire, we deployed our data collectors in Gaza. And so there was no actual fighting during that period. And the safety of our data collectors was essentially guaranteed as a result. The second problem, however, was not 100% addressed even by then, because we still lacked reliable information about the number of individuals who were still in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. We did not want to collect data in an empty area. That would not have made any sense for us. And so we decided instead to focus on the shelters where these hundreds of thousands of people have moved in the southern part of Gaza. Because we didn't know exactly how many people were still in their homes in the north, we could not be 100% sure that we had a fully representative sample from the northern part of the Gaza Strip. Our margin of error as the result was changed to 4%. Usually it is 3%, just because of that factor. We do think that everything else related to that survey went according to plan, based on reliable data that we had from the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics, and based on the information we've gathered on the shelters from both UNRWA and the Palestinian government. So that information, we think, gave us a sense of reliability, that we have a good sample, one with the exception of the north, one that we can certainly utilize effectively in this survey. So we're happy with the methodology. We're happy with the findings there. So what are these findings?
Can I interrupt you with a follow-up question on that, Dr. Shikaki? Because I'm seeing some follow-up questions in the Q&A. Folks are really interested in this. So it's not just me as a political scientist geeking out a little bit. And by the way, amazing work, really. I mean, it's just incredible. But can you say a little bit more about, I mean, my understanding is that you have data collectors on the ground who actually do in-person interviews. I mean, we're not talking about calling people on their cell phones, which in many cases would not have been an option anyway. I'd love it if you could, I mean, I think it'd be really interesting to hear more about that, who the data collectors are. I think folks are interested in digging in a little bit.
The data collectors are mostly females. who are from the local communities. Every town and city in the Gaza Strip had data collectors. We have a field force in Gaza of about 150 data collectors whom we deploy once we are ready for our surveys and once they are trained. And we have trained these data collectors for this survey prior to conducting the survey, as we normally do. They're all face-to-face, and they are all conducted normally at home. So with the exception of the northern towns and cities in Gaza, all other interviews in the south and the center of Gaza, with the exception of one locality, were conducted inside the household with the families themselves. That exception was something that we discovered. We did not have prior information about, but we discovered as our team was deployed. One locality near Khan Yunis has already been asked to evacuate, and so we knew where they were evacuated, and so we went to the place of evacuation and we interviewed them in that location. The interviews in the shelters, we collected data on all existing shelters. We then selected, I think, 25 or 24 locations in these shelters for interviews, and 10 individuals were interviewed in each location. This is normally 10 individuals or 10 homes are picked in every locality where we conduct our surveys. So essentially, again, with the exception of the shelters, this was essentially a normal survey in Gaza. Again, keep in mind the north.
I just have to, first of all, I have to compliment our audience. I love you guys. You are such data geeks. We are getting such great questions in the Q&A. People are interested in whether men are comfortable talking with women interviewers. People are interested in what the requirements are to become a data collector. People are interested in gender breakdown. I know in your results that you present in PCPSR, you have all kinds of breakdowns, but typically not gender breakdowns, I think. People are interested in gender breakdowns of results. We have lots of great questions, and folks, we can't spend our entire hour on the methodology, but I'll give you one more crack at this before we move on to the substance of the results.
This is a representative sample. Essentially, it means that men and women are represented equally, which is 50-50. If we do not mention it, it's just because we say it is a representative sample. It is also representative of all age groups. Our data collectors have a methodology to follow that allows them to interview a particular individual in the household with particular characteristics with regard to age. So they cannot just pick any individual. We have something called the quiche table, which determines what age will be interviewed in that particular household. Similarly, in the shelters, that quiche table tells us what should be the age of the first interview, the second interview, the third interview, and so on and so forth. So a representative sample is what all of our surveys require, and we deliver that for every survey, including this one. Again, I've mentioned earlier that we are not 100% sure about the northern part, just because we did not, and nobody had any credible information about the number of individuals who remained in their homes in the north, and we did not reach them.
Got it. All right. So turning to the substance, let's really dig into the substance and what were the key findings in that poll, and what perhaps surprised you, if anything?
What was not surprising, of course, was the expectation that two things will happen. One, that there would be a significant spike in support for Hamas. We essentially got that. But what was somewhat surprising, I would say, Gaza usually gives Hamas more support during wartime compared to where things were before the war than in this time. So the rise in support for Hamas was within the margin of error, 4 percentage points only, from 38 to 42. That was surprising, and it did indicate that there was some questioning, some reckoning taking place in Gaza, that is Gazans beginning to question Hamas, but not in the West Bank. And so that was the second surprise. Unexpectedly, the results indicated a more than threefold increase in support for Hamas in the West Bank, from 12% to 44%. It's almost 3.5 folds increase. And that was something we have never seen before, this rise in support. The reason I think for that, there are two reasons for why this was the case in the West Bank. One, the same period in which we were conducting the survey witnessed two things. One, significant rise in settler violence, that the Israeli army was seen as not doing anything about, and perhaps, in fact, taking part in. And secondly, Hamas had, you remember, this was done during a ceasefire. And what was the ceasefire all about? Release of prisoners, hostages, and Palestinian prisoners. And where did they come from? From the West Bank, the prisoners. And they were all released in the West Bank. So we were collecting data at a time when West Bankers were essentially celebrating the release of prisoners into the West Bank. That certainly prisoners is one of the most emotional issues for Palestinians. And this was a contributing factor. There was a third reason that I think, something we have not seen, we've seen before, but not as dramatically as in this case, and that is the lack of credibility for the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank. The Palestinian public believed that the passive attitude that was taken by the Palestinian leadership of the Palestinian Authority was unacceptable. That essentially it meant that the Palestinian Authority was abandoning Gaza, and was abandoning not just Gaza, but also its role in protecting Palestinians against settler violence in the West Bank. That the Palestinian Authority was spending 1/3 of its budget on its security sector, but was unable to deploy a single policeman in towns and villages that were vulnerable to settler violence. So a combination of these three factors does explain to us why there was such a spike in the level of support for Hamas in the West Bank. The second most important finding for us was a further increase in support for violence. This is to be expected. As I said earlier, every time there was a war, we saw a temporary spike in support for violence. We already had 1 year, or almost 1 year, since the election that produced the current Israeli government. And that survey after survey, we saw the gradual rise in support for armed struggle to confront the new Israeli government. And now there was a war, and this war added an additional component, that is the collective exposure to violence by the Palestinian public. Every time there is an exposure to violence, we see significant rise in support for violence. This is almost automatic relationship between exposure to violence and rise in support for violence among the Palestinian public. So this was certainly an important finding as well, although both findings, as I said earlier, are usually temporary and that they change and revert back to where they were before the war. A third finding was also surprising because and unexpected, but wasn't dramatic, and that is we expected to see a decline, further decline in support for the two-state solution because of the war. Normally, the war adds further added number of people who come to the conclusion that diplomacy and negotiations are futile. There is no feasibility for the two-state solution, and that leads to a decline in support for the two-state solution. Surprisingly, this did not happen this time, neither in Gaza nor in the West Bank. In both locations, we found an increase, a slight increase, however, within the margin of error for the two-state solution. It is not very high, just slightly more than a third. But it did indicate that the war this time did not actually produce negative results. My explanation for that, this is just my speculation, is that the talk about reviving the two-state solution, the centrality of the Palestinian issue once again in both regional politics and international politics, the focus on this issue brought back some hope that this could lead to a revival of diplomacy and negotiations that might have therefore prevented a significant slide away from support for the two-state solution. There's one last issue that I think was also important, and we don't know, this is the first time that we've looked into that, so we don't know how temporary this is going to be. But it is very important because it reflected a loss of trust in a rules-based international system. The Palestinian public came to the conclusion that Israel has committed atrocities in Gaza. Tens of thousands of people are being killed and injured. Most of them are women and children. And the international community, the leaders of the international community in the Western world are essentially supporting and allowing that to happen. That was the prevailing perception of the Palestinian public. And they thought, if this is something that the international community is not going to condemn and is in fact supporting by words and deeds, then this means the end of the rules-based international system. This, of course, is extremely dangerous if it is not addressed, because for the interest of the two-state solution and the support for the two-state solution from the international community has been critical in building public support for that idea. And so if Palestinians believe that the international community has essentially lost these rules, then this could certainly have a negative impact on how Palestinians view international rules and norms and so on. So these were basically the main findings. Now, obviously, we did ask a lot of other questions, most importantly about the behavior of Hamas men in the Israeli towns on October the 7th. This was one of the most important issues we wanted to explore. We wanted to know whether people supported what Hamas embarked on, but we also wanted to know what exactly that meant. Did they support what, for example, for the Israelis, what the Israelis saw as atrocities and massacres? Was that the Palestinian understanding of what happened on October the 7th? Was this why they were supporting it or opposing it, as the result might have been? And so we asked people various questions to ascertain that. We wanted to know, in theory, whether Palestinians believe that killing women and children in their homes was permissible under international law, or whether this was a war crime. And we also wanted to know whether people saw videos of Hamas men committing such atrocities in these towns. And we asked them whether they thought that this was a war crime that Hamas men were committing. So we asked all these questions in order to essentially understand the logic of the support or opposition to what happened on October the 7th. The findings indicate very clearly that the majority of the Palestinians know very well what international law does or does not allow. Close to 80% said international law does not allow the killing of women and children in their own homes. When we asked whether they have seen the videos, the overwhelming majority said no. This was mostly in the West Bank. In Gaza, we found 1/4 who actually said yes, they saw the videos. In the West Bank, the equivalent percentage was just 7%. So the West Bankers were not interested in looking at these videos, but Gazans were. And so the third question was, so did Hamas commit atrocities? And the answer of those who did see the videos was yes, by 10 times more than those who did not. So those who did not see the videos did not think Hamas committed any atrocities. The percentage was of those who thought Hamas did commit such atrocities was very, very small for those who did not see the videos. But for those who did see the videos, the percentage was much higher. And particularly in Gaza, the percentage was much higher. So essentially, if you did see the videos, you did come by a significant percentage to the conclusion that Hamas did commit atrocities. This is extremely important because over time, more and more people will be exposed to these videos. And the correlation is very clear. If you did see it, you are more likely to think that Hamas did commit atrocities. Now, this has implications for the other issues. Remember what I started with. I said support for Hamas did not increase significantly as we normally expect. This was one of the first surprising things we discovered. So why was that the case? Well, because more Gazans saw these videos. More Gazans, therefore, came to the conclusion that Hamas did commit atrocities. That is why there wasn't a great deal of increase in support for Hamas in the Gaza Strip. The West Bankers were a different story. I've explained why the percentage was higher, but now I described 3 drivers for that. But now there's a 4th driver, which is Gaza's West Bankers did not see videos, did not come to the same conclusion that Gazans have come to after looking at these videos.
So fascinating. Thank you so much for walking through those really interesting and important results. And you anticipated many of the questions that we've been getting. I just have one more question I want to add on the issue of Hamas and war crimes. In terms of the fact that even in Gaza, where more people saw the video, you said about 1/4 of respondents said that they had seen videos and much less in the West Bank. Question is, why? Was it that people didn't have the opportunity, or and this is, I think, very important because not only on the Palestinian side, right, but also on the Israeli side. I mean, what are Israelis seeing in terms of what's happening in Gaza, and how is that shaping their perception? So I think that this question of, are they even having the opportunity? What is the media doing? Is very important here. So if you could talk a little about that.
I think this is a very, very important question. I think during all times of wars, people under attack normally build their own bubble where they get their own information. The Israelis certainly are not looking at Al Jazeera hour by hour as Palestinians are right now. And what do Palestinians see right now? Women and children are seen hour after hour being killed, maimed, cut into pieces. The suffering of women and children and elderly, that's what they see. The Israelis do not look at Al Jazeera, they look at their own sources of information. They want the source of information that they trust the most. And during war, you trust your own media. And you go to your own media. And Al Jazeera has always been the most popular media for the Palestinians. If it's not Al Jazeera, then it is Al Aqsa that belongs to Hamas, or it is Palestine TV that was essentially showing what Al Jazeera was showing. And overall, almost none of those media outlets showed, at least extensively, these videos of atrocities being committed. This is one reason, but I don't believe this is the only reason. I think social media is almost everywhere, and people should have had access. But I think there was perhaps a deliberate decision on the part of those Palestinians, just as I am almost certain is the case among Israeli Jews today in Israel, to avoid looking at videos that might begin to undermine their narrative about the justice of their cause. This allows them deniability. So there is a denial element involved. During war, you don't want to confront anything that will significantly undermine your basic narrative. So there is an element of deniability. I can't put a number on that, unfortunately. So I don't know how much of it is really just people building their own bubble, or that this is something that is more about the denial that people are searching for, because it's more comfortable for them to deny something that is so uncomfortable for them to contemplate.
Thank you for that. So I want to kind of look to the future, and the future for both Hamas, the future for Fatah, the PLO, Palestinian Authority, and what might be ahead. And so let's start with Hamas. And what do Palestinians want Hamas to have part in the future governance of Gaza, of the West Bank, of a future Palestinian state? And then on the other side, you talked about the very low approval rating, very low public opinion toward President Mahmoud Abbas, the PA, Fatah. But at the same time, there's a lot of focus, of course, in the international community, from the US government, others, of a future in which the PA would ultimately take over governance in Gaza, perhaps, hopefully, as part of a unified Palestinian state in the occupied Palestinian territory. So based on your polling, would Palestinians accept that kind of a role for the PA? What would it require? There have also been a lot of discussions about something like a revitalized Palestinian Authority. So what would that need to look like in order to garner Palestinian support?
I think we are essentially looking at two things. One is the domestic balance of power and who has the trust of the people, who is seen as having legitimacy, who is seen as deserving to be the leader and the decision maker on behalf of the Palestinians. And the second is there a future for peace, for a two-state solution, the creation of a Palestinian state, and so on and so forth? These are two separate issues, but in this case, They are essentially linked, and one cannot address one without the other. If we ask, and there is a significant difference here between West Bankers and Gazans. Gazans seem a lot tougher on Hamas than West Bankers. I've already explained some of the reasons perhaps behind that. So there is no majority in Gaza in favor of Hamas returning to control Gaza. The majority is opposed to that. In the West Bank, the majority is in favor of that. This is a major difference between the two areas. Obviously, what matters the most right now is what Gazans think rather than what West Bankers think when it comes to the issue of the internal domestic balance of power and who is trusted. Gazans seem to want the Palestinian Authority, with all of its ills and problems and lack of legitimacy. They still think that one type of government, that is a national unity government, perhaps one of technocrats, one that does not report to President Abbas, or one that does report to Abbas. Gazans seem to favor that option, these two options, over the option of having Hamas resuming control over Gaza. The West Bankers do not want Abbas back in Gaza, but they will support a national unity government of technocrats that is interim, that can take control of Gaza and prepare for elections perhaps within a year. A national unity government agreed to by all factions, including Hamas, would be, it seems to me, the most likely scenario that will find a public support for who, after the war is ending and the Israeli army is no longer in Gaza, that this kind of government might take control. The question is, for what purpose? What is the end result? Is there an end game that this government will be electing a government for in the future to do what? Without a context along the lines of a two-state solution, it will be extremely difficult to put together such a government. And that means Israel will have to concede on that. Israel will have to agree that the long-term vision is for a two-state solution, and that the entire arrangement in Gaza is indeed to create a government that would be in control, eventually elect a government that will be in control of both the West Bank and Gaza as the two territories of the future Palestinian state. Without an agreement from Israel, therefore, the entire scenario of having a government, any kind of government, to control Gaza will be extremely difficult to put together and will not be sustainable. Any arrangement that does not rely on having a temporary setup leading to elections within a context of a two-state solution, in my view, is simply not sustainable, and most likely will be extremely difficult to arrive at, if not impossible to arrive at. And essentially, it depends not on what Abbas wants, but on what Israel wants, and whether Israel will allow a two-state solution to be the basis for any future arrangement. This current Israeli government is certainly not one that is willing to do that. The current US administration does not seem, while it favors that, does not seem willing to impose any kind of, use any kind of leverage or even put these ideas and vision in any manner of details that would be convincing, would be seen viable by the Palestinians. In other words, on the question of Hamas, in answer to your question, while Hamas is under a great deal of criticism in Gaza in terms of its return, nobody questions the legitimacy of Hamas to return as a political party that participates in elections, that has a say in deciding what the future of Gaza will be, along with all the other groups, including the Palestinian Authority and including Abbas, but that the Palestinians must go to elections in order to elect their own legitimate leadership.
On the subject of elections, one of the interesting findings in your most recent polling concerns the single most popular individual in terms of potential Palestinian leadership, and that is Marwan Barghouti, who is affiliated with the Fatah movement, has also been in Israeli jails for I think over 20 years now. What is Marwan Barghouti's popularity among Palestinians tell us?
Well, it means that the Palestinians in general tend to embrace secular nationalist values and ideology rather than religious ideology. In every single survey in which Barghouti competed against the most popular Hamas leaders, Barghouti on average received 2/3, and the most popular Islamists, did not receive more than 1/3 of the vote. That is essentially the internal distribution of the value system in Palestinian society. And this is one reason why Barghouti is popular. But why, in particular, this secular nationalist had to do with a combination of issues. One is about governance and the belief that he is incorruptible, that he's a Democrat, that he would be someone who would create an open political system where liberties are respected, and a fight against corruption would ensue, and so on. So that is an important governance issue, and they think Barghouti is the person who can deliver that. Obviously, Barghouti has never been in a position to prove that is the case, but this is the prevailing perception among the Palestinians so far. The second has to do with the belief that Barghouti comes from within the mainstream nationalist agenda that prioritizes the creation of a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. That he, in this sense, is a two-state person who will fight for a two-state solution that lead to the creation of a sovereign, independent Palestinian state along the lines of 1967. In this context, at a time when Palestinians do not believe that diplomacy and negotiations are viable, Barghouti has an advantage in the sense that Barghouti combines both diplomacy and violence together, that he is seen as a person who would fight for Palestinian rights, would fight to end Israeli occupation, even violently if necessary, but that he is also a realist and that he is a two-state person, and that diplomacy and negotiations, if viable, that Barghouti would pursue them with full strength. This is the attraction. There are other factors that we have seen over the years. He is seen as a unifier, for example, who would unify the West Bank and Gaza when compared to Abbas, who is seen as failing in unifying the West Bank and Gaza. Barghouti is seen as one leader who could easily unify the West Bank and Gaza.
Thank you so much for that. So as we get to the end of the hour, I want to close with two more questions for you, and I'll let you address them together. Different questions. One of the questions is about the public opinion of Palestinian citizens of Israel, which I understand is not something that PCPSR polls for. But if that's something that you would be able to comment on, that's a question that we've gotten from the audience. The other thing that a number of people have asked about is Palestinian public opinion vis-a-vis outside actors. You talked about perception of international law, But what is the perception of outside actors, including the United States, Europe, the UN, and Arab states, and the role that they're playing?
Well, on Israeli Arabs, we have not done a survey since October the 7th. The last joint Palestinian-Israeli survey we have done with our colleagues at Tel Aviv University was issued early last year in January, a year ago. We are hoping to be able to conduct a survey, I hope in the next 6 months or so, where we will be finding out more about how Israeli Arabs have perceived what happened on October the 7th and the ongoing war. Overall, all the surveys we have conducted since 2000, so 23 years of surveys, joint Israeli-Palestinian surveys, have shown two fundamental conclusions about Israeli Arabs. One is that they support negotiations, diplomacy, and the two-state solution, and all the relevant concessions and compromises that would be required to make a two-state solution happen. Israeli Arabs, supported by a very, very large majority, have always supported it by a very, very large majority, continue to do so during the worst days in Israeli-Palestinian relations. A majority has consistently ranged between 70 to 90%, has said yes to everything related to a peaceful solution along the lines of a two-state solution. That's one thing. The second is that Israeli Arabs find themselves somewhere in the middle between Palestinians and Israeli Jews. While, for example, my best example is the level of trust on the other side. Israeli Arabs, we asked them about trust on both Israeli Jews and Palestinians. Israeli Jews, we ask about trust in Palestinians alone. Palestinians, we ask about trust in Israeli Jews alone. And the findings show that Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs Israeli Jews and Palestinians do not trust each other. Only a small minority on both sides is willing to trust the other side or to believe that the other side is a partner for peace. We're talking about 15 to 20%, not more than that, who are willing to trust the other side. Now, look at Israeli Arabs. You will find that they are willing to trust both sides by very large margins. That explains why Israeli Arabs continue to trust the two-state solution and to support it by the level of support they do right now, despite all the difficulties that they too see in everyday life. On the other issue that you've asked about, outside actors right now, the outside actors they like the most, of course, are the ones who are standing with the Palestinians. This essentially means there's zero trust in the US. The trust in France, Germany, Britain are not much different than that. But the trust in China and Russia is higher. It's still not a majority, but it is better than the trust that they have in these other countries. By the way, the surveys we are currently conducting as part of the Arab Barometer in the Arab world also confirm the same findings in other countries. In Tunisia in particular, we have already completed that, and it did show similar findings as well. In terms of the regional powers, the country that is trusted the most is Qatar. It's not the Saudis, certainly, and Egypt and Jordan come somewhere in the middle, but it is the Qataris who are right now. Of course, Al Jazeera also represents Qatar, so you can see the influence of the media in shaping the attitudes of the Palestinians. Perception of Iran, which has in recent years been very, very low, has actually increased during this war. Perception of Hezbollah has significantly improved as well. So there is no doubt that the war itself has significantly altered a lot of ideas that the Palestinians had about outside actors, and most importantly, with regard to the standing, the U.S. standing, Western countries in general standing, and certainly countries like the Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have not been able during this war to regain the trust of the Palestinians.
Well, we've reached the end of our hour. We obviously could continue this conversation. Khalil, I always learn from you. This has been a really fascinating webinar, and it's just so important to actually be working with the data and hearing analysis from an expert like you, who obviously has a very, very long perspective. And so I really do encourage folks. My colleague has just dropped into the chat the link that you can go to get the recording of today's conversation. It'll be up hopefully soon, later this afternoon. And I really do encourage our audience members to share this with folks that you think will find it of interest. And I just want to close by thanking Dr. Shikaki. We are so grateful for your time, for your expertise, and for your work.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be with you.
Thanks so much. That concludes our webinar. Have a good day, everyone.